Today's daf we're going to be learning is Zevachim daf kuf tet. It's a bit of a simpler daf today. I will let you know. Again, if you haven't read yet Shuli Mishkan's article about bamot and listen to Alana's shir also about bamot and the whole idea of a central place for prayer. So I recommend listening. It'll be good to, again, give perspective on this whole chapter, really. We're now going to get started with the top of our daf. Today we have a bit of a simpler daf. Okay. Echad kodeshim kshirim ve'echad kodeshim psulim. Okay. Until now we've been talking about taking a sacrifice, slaughtering it outside, and then offering it outside. Today we're going to focus on offering things outside, which basically means burning them or offering them the way they were supposed to be offered inside. We're now offering them outside. And we're going to be liable. The question is, what's included here? So first they mention kodeshim kshirim. Kodeshim kshirim simply means, right, all sacrificial, like sacrifices basically. Not just olod, but shamim, all the sacrifices. Ve'echad kodeshim psulim. Not only are you going to be liable, we haven't gotten to the line yet that says if you offer them outside, you're going to be liable, but we'll get there in a few seconds. Hikrivam b'chutz chayav. Okay, that's if you skip a few words. All these cases, if you offer them outside, like burn them or, do the whole, what you're supposed to do, you do them outside the burning, you're going to be liable. Now, it's not only, now you would think, let's just be thoughtful about this. If you offer something inside, and then you're supposed to offer it inside, and instead of offering it inside, you offer it outside, makes sense. You're going to be liable, because you should have, this is going to be the underlying principle in general. This is going to follow us throughout the daf. If you're supposed to do it inside, and instead you do it outside, it's a problem. What if it's disqualified? If it's disqualified, we would think that you're not obligated if you offer it outside because it's disqualified, right? We've touched on this before. But if they're kodeshim psulim shaya psulan bakodesh, v'krivam b'chutz chayav, if they were of a certain type of disqualified, that they got disqualified in the kodesh. Okay, what does this mean? We actually saw this way back on daf Pei Daled. And it's the category, if you remember, Rabbi Shimon, you might not remember this, but Rabbi Shimon in the Mishna Kuf Daled says, when we were deciding which sacrifices that were disqualified, if you put them on the altar, would they not have to be removed from the altar? He said the answer is which ones yes, which ones not, if psulam b'kodesh. That was Rabbi Shimon's opinion, and this matches his opinion there, because it's all interconnected. If it would be something you would put on the altar, and we talked about this before also, if it's something you would put on the altar, that again, you're not allowed to put these on the altar, but if, in a minute I'll define what psulam b'kodesh is, I'm putting it aside for a minute. This category of items, if I were to put it on the altar, I'm not allowed to. It got disqualified. I'm not allowed to put it on the altar. But if for some reason I did anyway, we would leave it on the altar. Since that's the case, you can see why. Since it's what we call ra'ul l'mizbeach, right? It could potentially be brought on the altar. Now, again, you shouldn't, but if you do, it's absorbed by the mizbeach. Remember, we call this afilu lachmosh al mizbeach. It becomes the bread of the altar. The altar kind of, and we had, Alana actually had a shir on that topic also about, what this means exactly and different approaches to why this is, that it would stay on the altar. But putting aside the why, let's just talk about what is. Since it stays on the altar, so if you take that item and bring it outside, you're liable because it's something that could actually be burned on the inner altar. So, what's psulam b'kodesh? There was a debate then, and there's a debate here. Either it means once it got into the Azara, it became disqualified, as opposed to something that when it made its way into the Azara, it already was disqualified, like a blemished animal or something like that, right? Where the disqualification happened way before it even got into the sanctuary, into the Azara, the courtyard. But if it happened in there, like it became impure, it was left overnight, right? All sorts of things. We're going to see the list soon in a braita. Then all those items, if they went on the altar, they wouldn't have to be taken off. Therefore, if you offer them outside, you're going to be obligated. That's the first halakha in our Mishna, which really is made up of two halachot, which is, one is all kodeshim that are kshirim, and two is anything that was disqualified. But this type of disqualification, that if it were to go on the altar, it would stay. If you bring it outside instead, you're liable. Second halakha, hamale, and we're going to, as usual, the Gemara is going to first deal with the first, and then we'll get to the second later in the shir. Hamale kezayit min haolam u'min imurim b'chutz chayav. if you offer up a kezayit, okay, now you're chayav for burning meat of a sacrifice, or imurim, the fatty parts of the sacrifice that normally get burnt on a sacrifice. You're chayav at what shiur, what requisite amount. We're going to deal a lot with requisite amounts in the second part of today's class. Requisite amount of a kezayit. So as soon as you do a kezayit outside, you're going to be liable. But can we combine imurim, the parts that get burned, and the meat? Well, it depends. Our Mishna tells us, if it's an ola, you can combine them to get to a shear of a kezayit again. Not for a good reason, but to say, oh, you're liable because you did a kezayit. We're going to combine those two. Why? Because it makes sense to combine it in an ola, because there's no differentiation in a korban ola between the imurim and the meat. Everything gets burned on the altar inside. So if you burn it outside as a combo, half a kezayit of this, half an olive bulk of this, half an olive bulk of that, you'll be liable, because those things in general combine. But what seems very clear from the Mishnah, if it's, let's say, a different korban, where the meat gets eaten, either by the kohanim or by the owner, right? Like shlamim, let's say it would be the owner. So let's just take a shlamim. Since the meat gets eaten by the owner and the imurim get burned on the altar, if you offer half an olive bulk of this and half an olive bulk of that, they're not going to combine. First of all, there are two items that shouldn't combine for burning, because one gets burned, one gets eaten, right? And right, there's nothing wrong with you offer. You're supposed to eat the meat, but the real issue here is you have to have, and we talked about this a lot with pigul, if you remember. When I have a thought that I'm going to eat half an olive bulk of meat, let's say I have a thought I'm going to eat the meat 3 days later, okay? That's pigul, right? Or outside the place. But if I have a thought that I'm going to burn the meat tomorrow, which I'm not allowed to do, okay? So that's pigul. But I have to have in mind that I'm burning a kezayit, right? Now, since for pigul, it's either a thought about burning the meat or about, burning whatever gets burned, or, which could be the meat, or eating it, right? It has to be some sort of consumption by the altar, consumption by a person, but those two don't combine, because they're two totally different consumptions. One is consumption by the altar, one is consumption by the person. So they don't combine. You might remember we had this Mishnah, actually it was one of these repeat Mishnahs, that haktara and achila do not combine in a pigul machshava. If you say, I think I'm going to, right, I have in mind, I'm going to, while I'm slaughtering the animal, I'm going to eat a half an olive bulk in 3 days, and I'm going to burn half an olive bulk in 3 days. These don't combine, because one is eating, one is burning. Those are two different things. So here also, if we're talking about a sacrifice, that part gets eaten and part gets burned, you can't combine them, right? If we combine them to burn outside, they don't work. That doesn't work, because they're not both meant to be burned inside, so they don't combine for an action of burning outside. Okay, so let's go back to the first part. This is very simple, this part of the daf. We're going to have a braita. Okay, in general, this daf is more simple than the last few. We're going to have a braita that basically darshans the first few words, kodshim ksherim, and then kodshim psulim. And we're going to learn, it's not just, number one, we're going to do three things. It's not just korbanot olah, which it says in the pasuk, olah zevach. It's not just olah, it's all other korbanot. Where do we learn that from? It's not only korbanot, it's also, right, animal sacrifices or bird sacrifices. It's also other things that get burned completely on the altar. And it's also things that are disqualified and which type, okay? And they're going to derive it all from these two psukim. Let's go back to chapter 17. Remember, verses 8 and 9 are all about offering things outside, and these are the psukim. Alehem tomar, right? We have a whole thing about the word alehem, or ve'alehem. Ish mibeit Yisrael, a person who, from your nation, or min hager asher yagor b'tocham, or a convert who lives among you, asher ya'aleh olah zevach, that they offer up an olah, or zevach is a general sacrifice, something that's slaughtered. Vel petach ol moed lo yivi. Anyone, you won't bring them to ol moed lasot oto. Remember what we learned with oto? Oto meant in its complete form, right? Talk about that today again. La Hashem, right? You offer it to God. V'nifrotai yishahu me'amav. Okay, and then that person will get karet. So here goes the braita. Tanu Rabbanan. Asher yaleh olah uzavach. Eli ala olah. Right? The only type of sacrifice that was really explicitly mentioned there is the korban olah, which makes sense because it completely gets burned. So that's the example we're talking about when we talk about burning something outside. Minay lerabot imurei hasham v'imurei chataf v'imurei kochim kachim v'imurei kochim kalim. Okay, we're now going to talk about all the other kochim, which are asham, chatat, right? And what part are we talking about burning? Well, only the imurim. Those are the only parts that get burned. Those are the fatty parts, right? The unique parts of the korban that get burned on the altar when the rest of the kohanim get to eat. And what's imurei kochim? Didn't we just list kochim? This must mean the shalmei tzibur. If you remember, there's certain korbanot shlamim, like the 2 kivsei atzeret on Shavuot, that are communal peace offerings. They have the status of kochim. So those, how do we know those? And imurei kochim kalim, they just put in one big category because we haven't mentioned any of them yet, so all of them. Because again, the kochim, we already mentioned the ola. The ola is in, so you can't just say imurei kochim. They've already included that in ola. So they want to be specific when it comes to the kochim, and then the imurei kochim kalim, they just group them all together. That's shlamim, bechor, maaser, pesach. Okay. How do you know also those, if you offer them outside, you're going to be liable? Talmud lomar, zavach. Because it says zavach, that's a general korban. Okay, that is very simple. Minayin lerabot hakometz v'halavona v'aktoret u'mincha konim u'mincha kon mashiach v'menasech shloshet lugim yayin v'shloshet lugim mayim. Okay, now we're going to have a list of all sorts of things that completely get put on the altar, like the kometz. Now, if you might remember, don't get confused. There's the kometz and there's the kometz. What's the difference? Kometz is an action. We already quoted a Mishna that's coming up in tomorrow's daf, but we quoted it earlier that said, if you do the action of taking the kmitza out of the mincha offering, okay, for those who want to really know what it is, and you can manage to go to this workshop that we're going to, you'll really see kometz, how it works. For those who can't go, I know some people, by the way, have asked about doing it on Zoom. We can't do it on Zoom because it's someone's business and this is what they do, so they don't Zoom it. They have some Zooms that they do in general, like on just the lechem apanim. They have a Zoom workshop, but not on all the menachot. So we won't be able to have a Zoom specifically for this. So apologies to anyone who can't make it. But if you ever make it to Israel, you can go visit on your own whenever you want. It's always open. But anyway, the kometz is the action. To do the action of taking the piece out of the rest of the dough and separating it, that if you do outside is not a problem. But if this is the kometz, it's a noun. What the kohen took out there with his middle fingers, and that part is supposed to be burned on the altar, and instead of burning it on the altar, you burn it outside, that's a problem. Okay, that's called halat chutz. So how do we know the kometz, the levona, the frankincense that also gets burned? Some of that is from in mincha offerings. The frankincense gets burned. Also in the lechem apanim has frankincense with it, that gets burned, and it gets burned completely. And the ktoret, the incense that we offer, there's 2 incenses we offer. We're going to end our daf with this, which is the incense daily, every day in the morning and the evening. With the korban tamid, they did incense on the inner altar. They burned it, and again, it gets burned completely. And the incense in Yom Kippur, if you remember, the Kohen Gadol goes in with incense into the kodesh kodeshim. Uminchat kohanim mincha kohen mashiach. These are the mincha offerings of kohanim. If a regular person offers a mincha offering as a voluntary mincha, so the kohen takes a kometz, burns that permits the rest of it to be eaten by the kohanim. But if a kohen, or the Kohen Gadol who brought twice a day a mincha, what was called mincha chavitin, those menachot both got burnt completely. So if a kohen voluntarily brings a mincha to the Bein HaMikdash, it's burnt completely. So these are all burnt completely. Hamenasech shloshet lugin yayin. If you pour the wine libations, this is what they used to do with the sacrifices. They would pour 3 log of wine or 3 log of water, which is what they would do for the nisuch hamayim on. This is what we have simchot be'er shoeva. It was the things they did on Sukkot, and they would pour water libations. So if you take that same amount and you pour it outside, okay, so all these things, instead of doing them, they're supposed to be on inside, you do them outside. Talmud Lo, right? You're going to be chayav. How do we know? Talmud Lomar, right? This is all kodeshim kshirim. This is all, right? We included not just all other korbanot, other things that get burned on the altar or brought to the altar. Al petach ol moed lo yivienu. So what do you learn from here? If you didn't bring it to ol moed, anything that's supposed to be brought specifically inside the ol moed, means inside the Azara, or the Hechal, which is in the Azara, but one of those places, or even the Kodesh Kodeshim, if you talk about the Ktoret, right? All of those things are going to be obligated if you bring them outside and not to Ol Moed. Okay, now we have one last category here. So far, we've only been talking about things that can actually go on the altar. Mina and the Rabot Psulim, how do you know that disqualified things like Kigon, Halan, if it was left overnight, Hayotze, if it was taken out of the Azara, Hatameh, it was impure, Shenishchat Chutz Zmanov Chutzim Komo, Pigul, right? You slaughtered it with a thought you're going to either eat it or burn it outside the time or outside the place. Shekiblu Psulim, if disqualified people accepted the blood, meaning Kohanim were disqualified, let's say, or Zarkot Adam, or a disqualified Kohen accepts sprinkles the blood. V'anitanim lamala, lamata, shenitanim lamala. V'anitanim lamala, shenitanan lamata. Right? You were supposed to do it at the bottom, you did it at the top of the altar. You were supposed to do the blood at the top, you did it at the bottom. Hanitanim b'chut, shenitanan b'fnim. You were supposed to do it on the inner altar, you brought it to the outer altar. This is nice to hear because we've seen this a bunch of times. It should be familiar. Hanitanim b'fnim, shenitanan b'chut. So you're supposed to do it on the inner altar and you did it on the outer altar. Right? So you did it on the blood on the wrong altar. Or last case, going all the way back to the first Mishna. Pesach v'chatat shenitanan shelo lishma, right? If you did the Pesach and chatat, you did the blood shelo lishma, and now you take the meat and you burn it outside, right? The meat that was supposed to be the imurim, and you burn them outside, even though it's a disqualified offering. But again, all of these were disqualified in the kodesh, right? And if that means that if they were to be put on the altar inside, you would leave them, even though you're not supposed to. All these things, if you offer them outside, you're going to be liable. How do you know? Talmud Lomar, because this is what the braita is doing. It's connecting into psukim. Lo yavienu la'asot. It could have just said at all moed lo yavienu. What else are you going to do with it if not to do something with it? So why does it say to do? To do means any kind of kolam itkabel b'petach ol moed chayvim ala b'chutz. Anything that would be accepted in the ol moed, meaning if you stuck it on the altar, any sort of asiyah, any sort of doing that could work with it, then you would be liable for doing it outside. So far we had the halacha in the Mishna, we had a braita to prove it. Now we're going to move to the second part of the Mishna. Hamaleh kazayit min ha'olah. So now we said, if you took a kazayit from the olah, which was kazayit of the olah, half a kazayit of the olah mixed with the imurim, half a kazayit. So altogether you have an olive bulk of a combo of meat and fatty parts. And in olah they're going to combine. Olah imurim in. But shlamim, for example, right? Sacrifices where you don't burn the meat, lo. So shlamim v'imurehem lo. The meat of the shlamim and the imurim of the shlamim will not combine. That we discussed when we saw the Mishnah. Makes sense that they wouldn't combine. Tanina lahad de tanu rabbanan. And in fact, there's a Tosefta that supports this. We're going to look at a Tosefta in Meila. In Meila, there's a whole section that talks about which things combine and which things don't combine. It appears both in the Mishnah and in the Tosefta. We'll get there. So Rav Hashem, we'll get to Meila not so far off, not so distant future. We're there, they're going to say, oh, this and this combine, and this combine, and all sorts of things that combine. Olavi imureha mitzrafim l'kazayit lahalotam b'chutz. Okay, so far this Tosefta says exactly what we said in our Mishnah. Which two things combine? The meat of the olah with the imurim for the purposes of shkutei chutz, okay, or hala'at chutz, for burning them outside. Okay, perfect. And by the way, the Tosefta adds, not only do they combine for that purpose, but they also combine for other purposes. L'chayev alehem mishum pigul notar v'tameh. Meaning, if you have an olah and you have imurim, okay, and you have a kazayit of them, and now pigul, we said there's two issues where you could have a kazayit. One is, my thought is I'm going to burn and, right, or eat it beyond its given time. Well, again, in the olah, since it all gets burned, it means I'm going to have in mind while I'm slaughtering or while I'm sprinkling the blood, that I'm going to burn half a kazayit of the imurim and half a kazayit of the meat. That would combine, right? Or, what else is pigul? Well, once I do that, when do you get karet for pigul? For eating it. So eating a kazayit of the olah meat combined with the imurim would also work to say chayav and pigul, right? Because I ate a kazayit of whatever was messed up, and all those should combine. And the chiddush here is, it says in the Tosefta Meila, they combine, but not the shlamim, only the olah, it says, right? So then you would assume for shlamim they won't combine, not for pigul, not for notar, not for tameh. What's notar? If I leave the meat beyond its designated time, it's disqualified. If I eat it, again, in an olah, if I eat, the kazayit and the imurim combine. In a shlamim, we're assuming they won't combine. And tameh, if it becomes impure and I eat it, again, do they combine or not? Yes, they combine in an olah, but they won't combine to get to a requisite amount to actually make me liable if it's not olah. Now, the Tosefta really never mentions other sacrifices, but the assumption is because it says olah, only in olah they're going to combine, not in anything else. So this is really going to be our topic now, this pigul and notar, because we're going to bring a contradiction to this, Tosefta. So we're kind of leaving our Mishna, even though the topic started with our Mishna, but now we're leaving the world of chutz. I'm going to say, bishlama ha'ala'a, olak tikalil in shlamim lo. Okay, I get why, when it comes to burning it outside, why it's only going to be in an ola, because those are the only parts, right? Those parts all get burned in ola. But in a shlamim, when parts aren't supposed to get burned, you can't combine parts that get burnt with parts that don't get burnt. That makes perfect sense. But pigul v'notar v'tamei my time. Now, pigul v'notar v'tamei, I don't understand why it won't combine in other sacrifices. Right? Let's think about it. If I have a shlamim and I ruined the korban, and now, right, let's say it got notar or it was pigul, and now I eat a kazayit of the meat and the imurim together, what does it make a difference? It's not like something different was supposed to happen with each of them. Once I ruined the korban, nothing gets burned, nothing gets eaten, and then I eat it. Why wouldn't we say it combines? And more so than that, Hatnan, there's a Mishna in Meila also where I said the Mishna and the Tos have to discuss what combines, what doesn't. It says, Kol ha-pigulim mitztarfim v'chol ha-notarim mitztarfim. It says all piguls can combine to make you liable. And all notars, meaning all korbanot, shlamim, ola, all that. Kasha pigul ha-pigul, kasha notar ha-notar. Well, now we have a problem. Because the Tosefta says, shlamim doesn't now. It never says it, but it implies that it only combines for an ola, not for shlamim, for pigul. And also for notar, it doesn't combine. And the Mishna Meila says it all combines. So how do we explain that? Well, the Gemara says, pigul la pigul lo kasha. We're going to deal with each one differently. And what we're going to basically say is, what pigul means here, it doesn't mean the same thing there. And what notar means there, doesn't mean the same thing there. Okay? And we're going to, basically, pigul is going to still remain in the realm of pigul. We're just going to have two different elements of the pigul. Notar is going to mean something completely different. Notar just means remainder, right? So remainder could be remainder of something else, right? We usually use notar as a term, especially when it comes with pigul, to say the meat was left beyond its designated time. But you could have other remainders, and we'll see a case that they're going to say. So first, let's deal with pigul. Pigul pigul kasha kan pigul, which means eating the pigul. There, we're actually going to say, like I kind of said before, of course they combine in anything, because there's no difference between the imurim and the meat once I disqualify the korban. It's all just part of a disqualified korban. So if I eat a korban that became pigul, right, because someone had a thought about it and messed it up, and then I come along and eat it, a kazayit of a combo of any korban, doesn't matter which one, I'm going to be liable, because that's a kazayit of a disqualified korban. No reason to separate imurim and meat, even in a shlamim. At this point, half a kazayit of meat, half a kazayit of imurim for sure would combine. But you might remember when we learned about pigul, there was a whole Mishna that discussed, what if I had a thought that I'm going to eat a kazayit or eat a half a kazayit, right? The thought has to be that while I'm doing whatever action, let's say slaughtering or sprinkling the blood, I have a thought that I'm going to burn or eat, right? It has to be achila, consumption of either the altar of or of a person. I'm going to either burn or eat. Has to be my thought was about at least a kazayit in the wrong time or in the wrong place. So it said there, if I have a thought about half a kazayit of burning and half a kazayit of eating, we can combine that, right? So that's exactly this. When it comes to a pigul machshava, we can't combine. If I think, I said, I'm going to eat a half a kazayit of imurim and a half a kazayit of meat. Well, since only the meat is something I could eat, not the stuff I'm burning, right? Not the imurim. They don't combine in the shlamim. Okay? In an ola, of course they combine, because the whole thing's supposed to get burned. So I have a thought, I'm going to burn all of it, half of this, half of that. It combines to an olive bowl. But, okay, so when we say pigul, one means eating pigul, where I get karet. The other means turning it into pigul, right? Making it into pigul by my thought. My thought also has to relate to it, a requisite amount. So again, in the shlamim, we're not going to combine those two. Now, notar, lo kasha, kan benotar, okay. Now, when you're talking about notar, it's very similar to pigul. It's eating something that was disqualified. When it comes to eating a sacrifice that was disqualified, we can combine it. Okay? So the one that says, kol ha-pigulim mitztarfim, kol ha-notarim mitztarfim, that Mishna, it's talking about eating pigul and eating notar. So what's the one that says you can't combine for purposes of notar? Completely different case. We have a case Okay, and maybe I'll just read it, because now they're going to say, I'll just read it inside instead of telling you outside. Umanu, mane, and who does this go according to? Rabbi Yehoshua. So you didn't understand anything yet, don't worry. We're going to read it right now, Rabbi Yehoshua. They're basically say, this is the way we're going to explain the Tosefta. And, okay, the Tosefta, which says not in shlamim, they're not going to combine in shlamim. And it goes according to Rabbi Yehoshua, who says the following, and he describes the case. Detanya, Rabbi Yehoshua Meila. Kol Zevachim shebetoha. Shenishtayer mehen kazayit basar, turning out amubed, ukazayit chelev, zoreket adam. What's the case? I come into the temple, I have a sacrifice, and then we slaughter the animal. Before I sprinkle the blood, we lose the animal. And the only thing I have left is either a kazayit of the meat, which can get eaten, right? We're talking about a non-ola, or I have a kazayit of the chelev, which is to be burned on the altar. Again, we have always this comparison between things that are to be consumed, either consumed on the altar or consumed by a human. I can be zoreket adam. As long as I have a kazayit left of this animal, I can go ahead and sprinkle the blood. If I have less than a kazayit, I can't. Now we understand what nitotru is. What's nitotru? Left over from a lost animal. So we have a lost animal, and all we have left is a half a kazayit of imurim that are supposed to be burned, and half a kazayit of meat that can be consumed. Now we're going to see why those can't combine, because I either need a half a kazayit of something that can be eaten by a person, or a whole kazayit of something that can be eaten by a person, or a whole kazayit of something that can be eaten by the mizbeach, consumed by the mizbeach. So I can't combine them, and that's what Rabbi Yehoshua continues to say. Chatzi zayit basar v'chatzi zayit chelev. Right, chelev is the imurim. It's the same thing. If I have a half a kazayit of basar and a half a kazayit of the chelev, eino zoreket adam. They don't combine. So that explains the Tosefta. The Tosefta is talking about not notar, okay, when it says pigul, notar, v'tamei, that is very strange. Pigul, notar, and tamei, we've already learned is a threesome that goes together, and notar always means notar. Now we're basically going to say it doesn't really mean notar, okay? In this case, in this particular case, it means things that are left over, and that's because it makes no sense otherwise. So they're stuck in saying that. Uba ola, now, the source of Rabbi Yehoshua continues and fits perfectly with what we've been saying now. Uba ola, in a korban ola, chatzi zayit basar v'chatzi zayit chelev zoreket adam mipnei shekula kalil. But in an ola, if you're left with half a kazayit of meat and half a kazayit of imurim, of the chelev, of course you can burn it. Of course you can sprinkle the blood, because now you have a whole kazayit of something that's supposed to be offered on the altar. That works. And now we have this last line, which makes no sense whatsoever. I'm going to figure that out. This is just because we're bringing Rabbi Yehoshua. Umincha, if you have a mincha, afilu kula kayemet, even if the whole thing is still in existence, lo yizrok, you can't sprinkle the blood. Okay, what doesn't make any sense about this? Right, luckily for our workshop, there's no blood in minachot, okay? We're not slaughtering animals. Mincha maya vidita, what does blood have to do with a mincha? There's no blood in a mincha offering. And also, by the way, why would it be any different that the whole thing is there and you can't sprinkle the blood? That also makes no sense. So Amar Papa minchat nisachim haba im hazevach. What do they mean here? Remember the nisachim, and this is what we say in Musaf all the time. Minchatan v'nizkehem k'midubar. There's korbanot. With those korbanot, there's minachot that are brought and nisachim that are brought with them. Let's say I lose the animal, like our case that we're discussing. I completely lose the animal. I have nothing left of the animal, not a kazayit. But I have the whole mincha is still there. So comes the braita and says, Rabbi Yehoshua says, even if you have the whole mincha intact, it was this accessory to the sacrifice, but I have nothing left of the meat of the sacrifice, lo yizrok. It doesn't allow me to sprinkle the blood of that korban just because I say, oh, well, at least I have the mincha left. But obviously it makes sense because the mincha is not the animal, right? That it's an accessory. So having the mincha in existence doesn't really help me for sacrificing this animal, for sprinkling the blood. Okay, that's the end of that section. Now we're going to move on to the next Mishna. Hakometz v'halavona. Now this is all the things we mentioned already in the braita, but we didn't see it in the Mishnah. Now we're going to go to all these things that are burnt completely. Okay, hakometz v'halavona v'aktored u'minchat kohanim u'minchat kohen mashiach u'minchat nisachim. This one wasn't mentioned in the braita, by the way. The minchat nisachim is also completely burnt. The mincha that we just discussed a second ago, that goes with your sacrifice, gets completely burnt also. So the kometz, the part that I took out of a regular mincha that doesn't completely get burnt, but the kometz gets completely burnt, just the rest of the mincha goes to the kohanim. The levona, the frankincense, the ketoret, the incense, the mincha of the kohanim, or the mincha of the kohen gadol, or the mincha that goes with the korbanot. She'ekriv me'echa mehem kezayit b'chutz chayav. Now here we're going to have a machlok. Tanakama says, If I take a kazayit of those, even though theoretically the whole thing is supposed to be burned inside, by doing a kazayit, I've already done what we call a masa avera, right? An act of something prohibited, okay? Now, it doesn't make so much sense. Why? Because we learn la'asot oto, it has to be, in order to be chayav of burning something outside, remember it has to be complete. Now we had a 3-way debate about what complete means. Complete might mean the whole animal, right? Which here that would mean the whole item, the whole kometz, the whole mincha. Or it means an aver, right? A complete aver. As long as it's a complete aver, you're chayav, right? A complete limb. And then this doesn't make sense according to that either. But we did say there was a third interpretation. This seems to match that third interpretation, that as long as it's a complete requisite amount, that's enough. La'asot cho, the way the rabbis understand it is, as long as you do a complete kazayit, okay? Anything less than a kazayit, no, but a complete kazayit, yes. Rabbi Elazar potil ad shekrivet kulam. Rabbi Elazar says, wait a minute. What's this whole concept of slaughter, of offering something outside? It's that whatever you do inside, you can't do outside. Now, if I offered a kazayit of the mincha of the kohanim, and I offer only a kazayit of it inside, did I fulfill my obligation? No. So if I offer it outside, I shouldn't be obligated either, because those things go together, right? If I can't offer it inside as just a kazayit, then I'm not going to be liable if I only offered a kazayit outside. It would have to be that I did something that would have fulfilled my obligation. So according to Rabbi Elazar, you have to do the complete item outside in order to be liable. However, v'kulan shekrivan bifnim. What if I took the mincha nesachim and I did almost all of it, 95% of it I burned inside, shier mehem kazayit, and I left over just a kazayit, and then I took that last kazayit, v'krivo b'chutz chayav. Even Rabbi Elazar would agree, then I'm chayav. Because why? Because that kazayit is the make or break. If I bring it inside, I'll fulfill my obligation. If I bring it outside, so there is a case where Rabbi Elazar will actually obligate for a kazayit, and that's if you already did the rest of it inside, left over one little piece, brought it outside. That's something that had you brought it inside, you would have been fulfilling your obligation, and therefore if you bring it outside, you're liable. V'kulan shechasru koshehu v'krivam b'chutz patur. But they all agree that if you lost part of it, let's say part of the mincha, I don't know, some little kid was in there and ate some of it, right? And you don't have the whole thing anymore. Since you can't ever fulfill your obligation for inside, even a kazayit outside, you're not going to be liable for. The rabbis even agree with that. Hamakriv kodeshim v'imurim b'chutz chayav. If you offer, one second, right? Hamalek sheikriv abasar v'imurim mechubarim bo. Right? This is saying if you sacrifice the meat with the imurim, in other words, normally you just burn the imurim, so you're going to be liable for burning imurim. What if you burnt the imurim and the meat was attached? Okay, well, you're still chayav. Now we're going to bring a braita. And we're going to end with this braita today. Okay, we're going to basically, the whole daf is going to be relating to this braita. The first part connects to us. The second part, it's not so clear. So, Tana Rabbanan, hamaktir kazayit b'chutz chayav. Okay, this basically says, you take a kazayit, you offer a kazayit of one of these things outside, you're going to be liable. Okay, now, and the truth is, the Agahot, the notes at the side say it's missing the word ketoret. If you're maktir a kazayit of ketoret outside, you're liable. Chatzi pras bifnim patur. If you offer a half a pras inside, you're exempt. Okay, we don't understand this yet, so don't worry. What's a pras? A pras is a measurement. It's more than a kazayit. And what's the significance of a pras? Well, it's the measurement of ketoret, incense, that you need to bring on the inner altar. When you bring the ketoret daily, you bring a pras. That's your shiur. Okay, that's the amount you need to bring. Okay, so we don't know what this means. If you bring a half a zayit pras inside, you're exempt. Exempt from what? We don't understand. So at first they say, Kasal kadatach, they thought when they read this source, my patur, I just want to point out, right? The first part of this braita is talking about incense outside. The second is talking about incense inside. Okay? So we don't know what they're referring to when they talk about inside. We understand what they're referring to outside. If you take kazayit of Torah and you burn it outside, that's Tanakama basically in our Mishna. Kasal kadatach, my patur zal. Okay, they thought when they read this, that what does it mean? If a non-Kohen offers not the whole amount, part of the amount inside on the altar. They take the incense. They take half the amount. By the way, half an amount doesn't mean half. It could mean anything. Like, it could be a kazayit. It could be anything that's not a pras. Just kind of randomly just say half a pras, so it's obvious it's not the whole thing. They'll be patur. In other words, Azara can't go in and do the avoda. But if he does less than a shear, he's going to be exempt. So the Gemara says, Amai, haktarahi. How could you say Azara comes into the temple, burns incense at less than the shear, but they burned it? Of course they're going to be... You can't just go into the temple and start burning things, even if they're not the requisite amount. Of course you're going to be liable. So Amar Rabbi Zera, Amar of Chisda, Amar of Yirmiyah bar Abba, Amar Rav. So Rabbi Zera comes and brings an answer. Remember, it's Rabbi Zera. He says, my patur, you misunderstood patur. Patur tzibur. If someone offers, okay, a kohen, the incense inside, and burns, right, you have to burn it on the inner altar, the one in the sanctuary, the golden mizbeach, burns less than the requisite amount, the community fulfills their obligation. In other words, this issue of a pras, yes, it's a requisite amount, but it's like a ideal requisite amount. But if you did less, and as long as, it's more than a kazayit, you'll be yotze. Okay, and then the community doesn't need to bring more incense. But Amar Rabbi Zera, ikasheli hakasheli. And this is going to relate much more to our case, because that really doesn't relate at all. That's just about incense. He says, but after he answers that question, he says, but if you really want a question, I have a question for you. Hada Amar Rav Allah. Rav said on that braita, Beha afilu Rabbi. Now it says Rabbi Eliezer, it should be Rabbi Elazar. Okay, otherwise this makes no sense. Ha afilu Rabbi Elazar modeh. Even Rabbi Elazar agrees that if you offer, okay, Daha Rabbi, we're going to see in a minute, Daha Rabbi Elazar lav. Sorry, let's stop for a minute. Baha afilu Rabbi Elazar modeh. Even Rabbi Elazar is going to agree in this case that if you offer a kazayit of incense outside, you're going to be liable, because if you're chayav, if you're yotze inside, right, then you're going to be liable outside. But to have Rabbi Elazar lav haktarai kamar. But didn't Rabbi Elazar say you need the whole whatever was supposed to be done completely inside, you have to do completely outside in order to be liable for doing it outside? And here you didn't do the requisite amount. So there seems to be this contradiction. Why would Rabbi Elazar say, in our Mishna, I just want to point out, right? Here it sounds like, well, since you could get away with a kazayit, so Rav says, even Rabbi Elazar, since you get away with a kazayit inside, Rabbi Elazar agrees that you could even do a kazayit outside, you'd be liable, even according to Rabbi Elazar, who normally needs the whole amount. But our Mishnah said, ktoret, right? And what did Rabbi Elazar say? Until you sacrifice the whole thing. So what Rav says on that braita, that even Rabbi Elazar would agree a kazayit, completely contradicts our Mishnah. Our Mishnah says, ktoret, it's only going to be at a requisite amount of how much ktoret you need, which would be a pras. You're not going to be chayav for doing a kazayit outside. So how are we going to explain this? Well, we're going to try Rabba. Abaye is going to reject it. We're going to try Abaye. Rav is going to reject it. Okay? Now, Amar Rabba, b'haktara dehechal. What Rabba is going to do is say, we're distinguishing between offering in the hechal, in the sanctuary, and offering in the kodesh kodeshim. There's two different ketorets, as I said before. There's one the Kohen Gadol does in Yom Kippur, and there's the one that's done daily. And one source is talking about one, and one source is talking about the other. In the hechal, they all agree. Why? In the hechal, what did I say? You have to do a pras. But if you didn't do the pras and you just did kazayit, it's fine. And therefore, in other words, it's fine inside. You can be yotze or chiyuv. Fulfill your obligation. If you fulfill your obligation with a kazayit, then Rabbi Elazar will agree, and that's all that source in the braita that we brought. Rabbi Elazar would agree what Rav says about it, that even a kazayit outside, you're going to be obligated. That's not our Mishnah. Our Mishnah is talking about ki pligi b'haktara difnim. The machloket is, what about the inner? Now, the machloket is based on not what you're liable for outside, but what you're actually obligated to do inside. When the Kohen Gadol brings it in, now the Torah says you have to do a handful of the incense. He takes a handful and he brings it in. Now, Mar Saval, Malechofnav Dafka. Rabbi Elazar says Malechofnav means a handful. If you didn't do a handful, you're not Yotze. If you did only a Kazayit, you're not going to be Yotze. And that's Rabbi Elazar in the Mishnah, who says you're not going to be Patur until you do Malechofnav. And the rabbis, who don't require that, Savar, Mar Savar, Malechofnav Lav Dafka. It just says take a handful. Okay, it's like I say, take a handful of sugar. Yeah, I didn't mean exactly a handful. You could do less. It's fine. Torah doesn't really mean it literally. That's the first attempt. Abai says that's a ridiculous suggestion. In other words, and then again, it's not a machloket about what you're chayav for outside. I mean, it is ultimately, but it's all based on a difference of, is there actually a requisite amount for the ketoret inside or not? The end of the section of Vayikra, where it describes everything the Kohen Gadol is supposed to do, it says, now when it says chukah, it means you have to do it this way. And that's also applying to the ketoret inside, which means that of course you have to do melo chofnav. Of course you need a complete handful. So that's not the machloket. Okay, nobody disagrees. Everyone thinks that Kohen Gadol, when he goes inside the kodesh kodeshim, has to take a handful. Less than that, it won't be yotze. But ki pligi b'haktara dechutz. The machloket is the haktara outside. Now, what about it? Mar savar yalfinam pnim michutz, umar savar lo yalfinam. The one outside, everyone agrees that you can actually be yotze only with a kazayit. So now we have a machloket. According to the rabbis, they say, well, look, if you're obligated a kazayit for the ketoret, now don't get confused with outside; it's very confusing. Let's just call it the ketoret of the Holy of Holies and the ketoret of the golden inner altar. So the ketoret of the inner altar, a kazayit is enough, right? I'm supposed to do a pras, but if I did a kazayit, it's enough. And if I offered a kazayit outside, I'd be obligated according to everyone. So the rabbis say, well, if that's true for the ketoret that's offered on the outside the Holy of Holies, meaning in the heichal, they just call it chutz here. It's not really chutz. It's not even the mizbeach chitzoni, right? It's the pnimi, but it's just not as inner as the Holy of Holies. If that's the chutz case, if in that case of the ketoret that goes on the altar that's not all the way inside the kodesh kodeshim, I'm going to be obligated if I offer a kazayit outside. Let's just say we're going to learn the same thing for the ketoret that goes in the inner Holy of Holies. Even though the requisite amount is a meloch of not a handful, I'm going to be obligated even if I offer a kazayit because we're going to learn ketoret from ketoret. And Mar Savar lo yafina, and Rabbi Lazar says no. You only chayav malach of not because there's pnim and there's chutz. Those are two different cases. There's ketoret this and there's ketoret that. Ketoret this has its own halacha. Ketoret that has its own halacha. You don't learn one from the other. So now comes Rava to argue over what Abaye put in the mouth of Chachamim here. Okay, what Abaye put in the mouth of Chachamim, Rava says is ridiculous. You're going to say we can learn the ketoret from the Holy of Holies, from the ketoret and the heichal, when one is in and one is out? We don't even learn out from out. Okay, we don't even learn cases that are done on the outer altar one from each other. And therefore, how could you think and suggest to learn something that happens with the ketoret and the heichal to learn it from what goes on in the inner of the Holy of Holies? And that's basically where we're going to end today. If you can't learn outside from outside, how are you going to learn outside from inside? Again, don't be confused. Outside here means inside the Azara, not offering it outside. We're talking about the laws of offering something outside completely for something that was supposed to be done outside of the Azara, in the outer altar. We don't learn one from the other, so we're certainly not going to learn something that's in the heichal from something that's supposed to be done in the inner of Holy of Holies. Mahi, what's the case that Rav is talking about? You might have thought if I do less than a kazayit of a kometz, or less than a kazayit of the imurim, and I offer them outside, I'd be chayav. Or or if I offered a libation, remember, what did it say in the Mishna? I'm liable if I poured 3 log of wine or 3 log of water outside. But you might have thought maybe less than 3 log of wine or less than 3 log of water, I'll be liable. Yeheh chayav, if I did it outside. Talmud Lomar la'asot. Ala shalem chayav ve'eno chayav ala chaser. Right? It's really la'asot oto. I'm only liable on a whole thing, which is a whole requisite amount. So, again, since for the kometz it needs to be at least a kazayit, for the imurim it has to be at least a kazayit, for the log yain and log mayim it has to be at least 3 log, right? For the nisuk, for the libations of the wine and the water, it has to be at least 3. I'm only liable if I did a whole shiur. Now, hapachom mishlosha lugim, here we're going to do the math now. Less than 3 log of water, like could be 2.9, okay? 2.9 log of water or wine, De'ibu kama zeitim. There's a bunch of olives in that shear. It's already an olive bulk. V'lo yalfe rabbanan chutz michutz. And they don't say, hey, look, when it comes to burning parts on the altar, it's kazayit. So let's learn from there to the nisuch, and we'll obligate you even in a kazayit. And they say, no, you're only obligated till you get to 3 log. So what do you see? They don't learn chutz from chutz. If they don't learn chutz from chutz, then they're not going to learn chutz from pnim. Okay? So, from there, or pnim michutz, actually. We're not going to learn to what happens in the Holy of Holies from the... So, Rava rejects this, and we're going to have to see how Rava explains this in tomorrow's daf. Okay, so that's the end of our daf. What we did today, we started with the Mishna that talked about all the items that you're offered for offering outside. Both Mishnayot actually are discussing that. We started with saying kochim ksherim and kochim psulim. Also, the psulam was bakodesh. We then brought the braita that showed all of that, including the derivation for all the things in the next Mishnah, which are things that get completely burned inside, and that if you offer them outside, you're liable. We brought all the derivations from that from the psukim. Then we went back to the second part of the Mishnah, which was if you the kazayit of an ola and the imurim combine to obligate you to, if you did a kazayit outside, but we infer from there not for a shlamim, then we had a whole contradiction between this braita we quoted, the Tosefta that said the same thing, and then this Mishna and Meila, which seemed to indicate, right, remember we got off topic because the Tosefta, which agreed with our Mishnah, basically brought in also pigul and notar, and it said the opposite of what it said about pigul and notar in the Mishnah and Meila, and we had to resolve that. Okay, after resolving that, we then move back on to the next Mishnah with all these items where we have a machloka between Rabbi Lazar and the rabbis about what if you didn't offer the complete requisite amount. Rabbi Lazar says you're not obligated even if you did a kazayit, and the rabbis say no, you're obligated just for a kazayit. And then we got into, in the Mishnah, in the Gemara, we quoted this braita that we didn't really understand about the incense, and then said, oh, this seems to contradict, right, after explaining what it actually means, which we didn't know at first, and then we explained, and we said, oh, wait, but Rabbi Zever said, look, that actually contradicts our Mishnah, because there it says the Torah, Rabbi Lazar says kazayit, and Rav on that Tosefta said, on that braita, said even a kazayit, right, even a kazayit, he would say, or less than a pras. And then we had to reconcile, and we tried 2 options, but didn't work yet. So, right, the basic idea was to try to distinguish between the incense that's brought on Yom Kippur and the incense that's brought in the sanctuary. But we didn't really succeed, and we're going to get back to this tomorrow. Wishing everyone a good day.